Hey, I'm Jet Smith, the head speech and debate coach at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho, and today I'm joined by.
Joseph Tyler, the head speech and debate coach at Century High School, also in Pocatello, Idaho.
And today we have recorded a demonstration debate on the upcoming January-February 2024 Lincoln Douglas debate topic, which is the United States federal government should substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia North Africa region. I will be on the affirmative.
And I'll be on the negative. We hope you all enjoy.
Thanks for watching. Because I believe that the world needs peace, not our military presence, I'm proud to affirm the resolution the United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia North Africa region. To clarify the debate, I observe that first, military presence encompasses a country maintaining military facilities, deploying military personnel in the territory of another country, according to the Encyclopedia of World Problems and Human Potential, no date. The West Asia North Africa, or WANA region, includes 22 countries in a triangulated area spanning from Morocco to Ethiopia to Iran, according to Ibrahim and Law 13. And third, in the context of military programs, the Department of Defense in 1991 defines a substantial reduction as 50% or more. Because the term ought implies a moral obligation, the ultimate value premise in this debate should be morality. Driver 22 of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines morality as a set of norms and principles that universally govern our actions. To measure the resolution's achievement of morality, I propose the value criterion of fulfilling one's duty to avoid harm. International relations philosopher Andrew Linklater writes in 2011 that states cooperating to avoid and prevent serious harm is the most fundamental moral obligation present in world politics. Embracing the universal duty to avoid serious harm allows political communities to coexist harmoniously. You should prefer this value criterion for two reasons. First, the harm principle grounds and unifies diverse interpretations of morality. Gert 20 points out that while societies interpret many aspects of morality differently, all accounts of morality are grounded in a prohibition of harm. Second, the harm principle serves as a foundation for generating other moral obligations. Linklater 11 explains that in the context of international relations, nations must have confidence in mutual commitments to avoid harm before accepting duties of beneficence. The thesis of the affirmative is that because substantially reducing presence from the WANA region fulfills the duty to avoid harm, the U.S. ought to do so to uphold the ultimate value of morality. I support this thesis with two contentions. Contention 1: reducing military presence avoids entanglement. The West Asia North Africa region is at a boiling point that threatens to erupt. Hoffman 23 writes that thanks to the Israel Hamas war, the Yemeni civil war, and Iranian aggression, the United States is at a major risk of being drawn into the conflict. Specifically, the United States has suffered at least 23 attacks as a result of its substantially increased military presence in the region. Richmond 23 furthers that if these attacks continue, they'll inevitably cross thresholds that force nations to escalate. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and more are increasingly likely to attack U.S. forces in the region. This would provoke a devastating U.S. response, spelling disaster for all nations involved. The impact of U.S. military entanglement is global warfare. Zax 23 warns that enemies of Israel would take advantage of the country's focus on Hamas to launch a full-scale attack, drawing the United States forces in to protect its ally. That would enable Russia to engage in a major counteroffensive in Ukraine and China to seize the opportunity to launch their long-desired invasion of Taiwan. Worst of all, Zax concludes that de-escalation tools that existed in the Cold War no longer exist, and there are insufficient means to prevent acceleration. Duffy 23 explains that expanding military presence in the region will result in lost lives and economic ruin, clearly violating the harm principle. Thankfully, this outcome is not inevitable. The United States can correct its course by substantially reducing its military presence in the region to enable its allies to develop their own security capabilities. Duffy concludes that this strategy is the only way to stave off a military catastrophe. Contention 2: reducing military presence decreases terrorism. The risk of violent terrorist attacks by extremists is at its highest level since 2015. Detmer 23 explains that turmoil in the WANA region routinely increases extremist activity as it provides inspiration for both lone wolf actors and formalized groups like Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others to radicalize and mobilize their followers. Counterproductively, the United States has used the threat of terrorism to justify its military presence in the region. But this strategy has failed to reduce terrorism, as Mullins 23 synthesizes that the United States military presence in Iraq and Syria has only increased hatred for US troops. Goals 20 furthers that US military presence is an expensive and ineffective tool for combating terrorism. In fact, the United States military generates grievances and acts of violence against regional actors that inspire additional acts of extremism. A study conducted by Akins 19 found that U.S. military presence likewise disrupts more effective political and economic counterterrorism efforts. Akins 19 concludes that their dissertation by recommending that the United States end its counterproductive reliance on military force to combat terrorism. Jigardar 21 adds that while the US's military presence was supposed to reduce terrorism, it has actually been its primary cause. They conclude that the United States should embrace a strategy of offshore balancing, in which the United States substantially reduces its military presence to exclusively intervene when our interests are threatened, and instead engage diplomatically with the region. Jigardar concludes that reducing U.S. military footprint in the WANA region would reduce acts of anti-American terrorism. Terrorist violence and terrorist counter responses both violate the harm principle. Thus, because substantially reducing U.S. military presence in the WANA region would fulfill the duty to avoid harm by avoiding entanglement and decreasing terrorism, you ought to affirm to uphold morality. And I'm open for cross-ex.
All right. 3 minutes on the clock. You ready?
Yep.
Perfect. Let's begin on the framework. What does morality look like for in terms of the judge's decision for this round?
The goal of a judge in Lincoln Douglas is to be an ethical decision maker, and I tell them that the way they do that is aligning their decision with a normative code of what is right and wrong, therefore upholding the value of morality.
Okay, but morality itself isn't a code of right or wrong, so how are we actively determining that?
Our definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says that morality is a code of normative behavior that tells us what right and wrong is, which I tell you, you follow that code by upholding its one central tenet across society's interpretation of morality, which is avoiding harm.
Okay, let's talk about avoiding harm then. How do we know when that's been fulfilled?
For the purpose of this debate, if an action reduces suffering and reduces death, then I would say that that's a pretty easy way to tell that we're reducing harm.
Is there a limit of some kind, or if I on the negative prevent one death, do I just win?
No, obviously there's two sides of the debate. Whoever does a better job at minimizing harm and fulfilling the duty to avoid harm should win.
Okay, sure. Is there a way to be able to prevent harm in its entirety?
Even if harm is going to exist either way, you have a duty to avoid it whenever possible. If voting affirmative fulfills that duty better than voting negative, that's what the judge should do.
But if harm is going to exist regardless, then shouldn't we be looking towards a different criterion since harm is always going to occur?
That's like saying we should have no laws because some people are going to break the law. So no.
All right, let's move on to more what the actual advocacy looks like. What does a substantial reduction actually look like in terms of this debate?
The definition I give you says a substantial reduction would be decreasing by 50%. Specifically, we would reduce our military troop presence by at least 50% across the region,
Okay.
and we would vacate various bases located around the WANA.
All right, cool. Let's talk about your first contention of entanglement. We are saying that there's a boiling point in the WANA region. What does the actual brink look like? What's going to push that? How do we actually get pushed over the edge there?
The specific link I offer you in the case is that U.S. forces will be attacked, and when that results in casualties, the president will have no choice but to respond with force, which will provoke more forceful responses from other regional actors, which then gives China and other aggressive actors the green light to engage in their own military offensives elsewhere.
Okay, so if it's about the U.S. being attacked, you cite that there have been 23 attacks already.
Correct.
Why hasn't that been triggered yet?
Because that piece of evidence indicates that those attacks have yet to result in the death of any U.S. soldiers. They have only resulted in minor injuries.
Okay.
When those attacks continue to escalate and result in death, that is when the U.S. response will be provoked.
All right. Lastly, when you're talking about our second contention, how do we address terrorism if we're removed from the regions at all?
Our job is not to address terrorism, it is to prevent it from happening, and our actions in the region are what promote terrorist recruitment and therefore terrorist attacks.
Okay, and that's time. Thank you. All right. Everybody ready for the next speech?
Yep.
I say everybody, like not just you right here. Okay. Let's begin. I am proud to negate the resolution. The United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. I accept the AF's definitions, but to clarify, would also observe that according to the University of Missouri, morality possesses three varying degrees of right behavior. Acts can be 1, merely morally permissible or allowed, 2, moral obligations or requirements, or 3, supererogatory, meaning that they go above and beyond. The affirmative then must prove that a substantial reduction in U.S. military presence is required for the USFG to be moral, rather than it simply being morally excusable or applaudable. Now, however, I would say that because the topic concerns U.S. government action, the ultimate value premise in this debate is governmental legitimacy. Fabienne and Ten clarifies that the political legitimacy is the authority of a state to wield political power derived from consent of the governed. To measure this resolutional achievement of government legitimacy, I would then propose the value criterion of protecting citizens. This ensures consistency with Thomas Hobbes' social contract. The Ethics Center in 16 explains Hobbes' philosophy of government as only being necessary to avoid a chaotic state of nature, where no rights would be respected, making the sole responsibility of government to protect its citizens' rights. You should be preferring this value framework for 2 reasons. 1, the social contract is the foundation of our society. According to Dr. Friend, in No Date, they write that without it, cooperation for the sake of any other value is impossible because nobody can be expected to fulfill obligations. And 2, the social contract ensures governance for the people. Berduffi and Duchy in 15 argue that citizens accept to be bound by the social contract because the government becomes obligated to protect their lives and their rights. The thesis of the negative, therefore, is that because substantially reducing military presence from the WANA region does not protect citizens, the U.S. federal government ought not to do so to maintain its governmental legitimacy. I support this thesis with my sole contention: reducing military presence destroys U.S. influence. U.S. hegemony, or its status as the world's strongest superpower, was built on leadership, norm setting, and military prowess. Scrafton 23 explains that partners align with U.S. interests out of their own self-interest. Wong in 23 exemplifies that WANA regions like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Israel have sought security reassurances from the U.S. in response to recent geopolitical turmoil. A substantial reduction in military presence in the WANA region would result in a power vacuum for 2 rising powers to fill in, the first being China. Robinson 23 explains that China poses a serious threat to the essential regions containing key U.S. military bases and thousands of our troops. Jet in 23, not this one, confirms that our presence reassures allies and sends a clear message to China that we aren't going anywhere. The second, though, is Iran. Ciosardi in 23 reports that alliances in West Asia are crucial to maintaining America's influence and curbing Iranian aggression. Otherwise, Forozish 23 warns that Iran's development of nuclear weapons and ties to extremist groups throughout the WANA regions would enable it to enlarge the Israel-Hamas conflicts to catastrophic proportions. The impact to deterring China and Iran is preventing conflict. Rachman in 23 finds that Israel and Saudi Arabia would fail to contain Iran without U.S. military backing, and a U.S. withdrawal would embolden China to attack Taiwan, threatening democracy and global security. Michta in 23 concludes that the solution is to rebuild, not draw back U.S. military forces, ensuring stability, the protection of its citizens, and the maintaining of governmental legitimacy. Let's move on to the affirmative constructive. Starting on their framework, you should prefer the value premise of government legitimacy over morality for 2 reasons. 1, morality is far too vague. Government legitimacy specifies which moral agents' actions we're actually evaluating rather than just a blanket statement of morality. And 2, the resolution is about state action, which necessitates a political philosophy, not individual action. That's something that requires moral philosophy instead. And their criterion of minimizing harm is insufficient as a weighing mechanism for 2 reasons as well. The first, because the harm principle lacks clarity. Gibney and Wyatt in 20 explains that society can't even agree on what classifies as a harm, let alone on what harms actually matter the most. And second, the harm principle makes rectification immoral. If a person or a government does violate their duty and harm somebody else, a response in any way that brings harm to the perpetrator would be deemed impermissible. Thus, when evaluating this debate, the most ethically sound decision-making system is to vote for the side that protects citizens, because doing so upholds governmental legitimacy. Now, a broad overview to respond to their substantive material. The key problem with the affirmatives case is that they want to substantially reduce rather than reallocate U.S. military presence in the WANA region. Duffian 23 explains that consolidating U.S. forces at key bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and the UAE would be sufficient to deter adversaries. And Lawrence in 22 adds that a reallocation of troops and consolidation of bases would still leave the U.S. capable of countering aggressive rising powers and extremism. This proves that the affirmative has presented a solution that is at best permissible or supererogatory rather than something that's a moral obligation, something they have to do in order to win the round. On their first contention of entanglement, I have three responses here. One, there's no rogue actor escalation. Yacobian in 23 reports that Hezbollah and Iran fear consequences from Israel and the US too much to enlarge the Israel-Hamas war. Two, there's no drawing in. Dasa in 23 writes that major powers and neighboring nations would rather dedicate their resources to budding economic projects. And three, a term. Military presence deters attacks and strengthens security partnerships. Olson in 23 explains that our bases and troops in the region give us an edge over our competitors while boosting readiness and allied confidence. This proves that the best way to protect citizens from and to minimize the harms of entanglement is to negate the resolution. And on their second contention of terrorism, I have three responses here. The first is another term. Reducing military presence makes it harder to fight terrorist groups. Tadoino in 19 exemplifies that reducing U.S. forces in Syria hurt training and support efforts for their partner forces and disrupted long-term operations against ISIS. Second, there's no impact to this. Hale in 23 writes that even after Hamas, the threat of terrorist attacks striking America is diminished, but our physical presence is necessary to contain the threat of terrorism to the WANA region. And three, turn. Military presence builds relationships. Olson 23 explains that when diplomatic and economic ties, which the AF tells you are key to counterterrorism, are weaker, our military presence is the way we preserve these strategic partnerships in the region. This proves that the best way to protect citizens from and to minimize the harms of terrorism is to negate the resolution then. Ultimately, it's clear that the most ethical decision you can make is to protect citizens by refusing to substantially reduce the U.S. military's presence in the WANA region in order to maintain the U.S.'s governmental legitimacy. With that, I open myself up for cross-examination.
All right, ready for cross? Okay, then let's go ahead and begin. My first question, what does it mean for a government to be legitimate?
So, per the definition that we're reading for this debate from the negative, government legitimacy comes when the individuals who the government actually governs give consent for the government to take actions and make responsibilities based off of their decisions. In the United States, that looks like having an election where every citizen is able to participate and then accepts the outcomes of that election.
So a government is legitimate if it wins a popular vote and the citizens like it? What does that have to do with what we're debating?
So the reason this sort of comes into play is that we need to ensure that the government's actions still reflect the will of the people and reflect the actual priorities of the government itself. And one way to be able to actually establish that comes through protecting our citizens.
Speaking of which, what does it mean to protect citizens and what do they need to be protected from?
So there's a few particular places that we would tell you that citizens need to be protected from. But when it comes to actively protecting them, we would say it's similar to reducing harm, but we're limiting it in scope to the United States citizens because that's what the United States is. Its government legitimacy is to its own citizens.
But is this a domestic policy topic or a foreign policy topic?
That's one of the beauties of this particular topic is it sort of combines both, but it comes at this from the perspective of the United States taking a particular action. And when you consider what scope the United States actually has in terms of its resources and knowledge of what's going to happen, its citizens ought to be its first priority.
Okay, so you say that rather than substantially reducing, we should just reallocate. How much troops would we reallocate? Are you still reducing? What does the world look like under reallocation rather than a reduction?
So that's where that Duffian 23 evidence comes into play here. Duffian 23 identifies that one of the best ways to actually address the problem is not to just get rid of our forces and pull them from the region altogether, but rather to reallocate and move them from one place and consolidate our bases. So it's not even necessarily reduction of boots on the ground, but rather moving them in places to regions that are much more that require their presence in a much more efficient manner.
But we would be at fewer bases rather than the same number, correct?
I think that even if there are fewer bases, that's not a substantial reduction as a definition of 50%, but you still need to consider the fact that we wouldn't be abandoning bases altogether. We are simply reallocating and moving people from one region to another where they are more needed.
So, why does the United States, on your contention, need to be the global hegemon or most influential country?
Sure. So that's the premise of our first contention is we tell you that without the US being a key leader, then there's fill-in from competing more dangerous states. We talk about China and Iran specifically. China filling in is particularly dangerous in the sense that they have the potential of being able to escalate conflict and leading to an attack on Taiwan.
Is the only way for a government to be legitimate to be the hegemon?
No, I would say the best way for a government to be legitimate is to protect its citizens.
Gotcha. Right. In this speech, I will first discuss framework, then I will defend the affirmatives case, and then move on to attack the negatives. Is everyone ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then I will begin. Because I believe the world needs peace, not our military presence, I am proud to affirm. On the framework debate, the goal of making an ethical decision is best realized through a normative code of what is right and wrong. Prefer the value of morality over governmental legitimacy for two reasons. First, reject Hobbes' philosophy. Absolute liberty is not the only way to determine a good government. And second, even if the topic is about states, governments are made of individuals that should be making moral choices. The duty to avoid harm overrides protecting citizens as a criterion for three reasons. First, they concede that the obligation to avoid harm is universal across interpretations of morality. Second, their criterion doesn't care about consequences of our actions on non-US citizens. And third, avoiding harm and suffering of innocent civilians is a clear enough standard. This means if I can prove that substantially reducing military presence avoids harm, your moral obligation is to affirm. They say we should reallocate rather than reduce troops, but first we should do both, as their own Duffy 23 evidence concludes a substantial reduction and consolidation of remaining troops and bases is the best option. And second, reallocating without reducing fails to minimize the risks of attacks on our troops or anti-American sentiment, so it won't solve my contentions. On my first contention of avoiding entanglement, tensions have reached a boiling point in the WANA region, and attacks are poised to continue against US bases. That will provoke a devastating US response, plunging the region into widespread conflict, provoking Russia and China to launch military offensives. Group their first and third responses about no escalation. They failed to respond to small-scale attacks on US forces as the linchpin that snowballs into broader conflict. Mitchell 23 corroborates that this will force the United States to retaliate, spilling over. They say our presence builds relationships, but they concede the Atkins 19 evidence from my contention 2 that says diplomacy and economic partnerships are impossible because of tension from our military presence. This contention proves that only a substantial reduction in US military presence will avoid attacks on our forces and enable our allies, avoiding a military catastrophe and thus avoiding harm. On my contention 2 about terrorism, the risk of terrorism is large in the status quo because of the WANA region's instability. Decades of counterterrorism efforts have backfired, and extremists use our actions to radicalize and mobilize their followers through anti-American sentiment, increasing the rate of violent attacks. Group their first and third responses about military presence enabling counterterrorism. Those efforts clearly didn't work when our military presence was even at its highest levels because the military is not the best option. Their second response is that terrorism has no impact, two responses. First, tell that to victims of it, and second, containing terrorism is the problem, not the solution. They ignore the Atkins 19 evidence, which explains US presence increases terrorism regionally, which is still harm. This contention proves that adopting a strategy of offshore balancing by substantially reducing our military presence will enable more effective diplomatic and economic counter-terror strategies to protect people from extremist violence, thus avoiding harm. On the negatives contention about US influence, I have three responses. First, no uniqueness. Cohen and Bremer 23 explain that US influence in the region and globally is already declining. Second, no link. Their own Duffy 23 evidence against my case proves that Iran is too afraid to escalate the conflict as long as the US maintains some presence. Third, turn. Reducing our presence enables focus. Ashford and Kronig 23 warn that supporting Ukraine and simultaneously increasing involvement in the Middle East spreads us too thin and enables China to attack Taiwan. Thus, you ought to affirm to substantially reduce military presence in the WANA region because doing so avoids harm, achieving the value of morality.
Last speech for Neg. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
All right. With that, then, let's begin. Because I believe that the U.S. must lead the world and not abandon it, I am so proud to negate. In Lincoln-Douglas debate, the role of the judge is to be an ethical decision maker. I've provided a superior ethical decision-making framework through the value premise of government legitimacy and the value criterion of protecting citizens. You need to prefer this over morality. One, they say that Thomas Hobbes' philosophy is wrong, that even if liberty isn't the only concern of government, it's the most important. But without a state, we would exist in a state of nature where people would use their liberty to take away the rights of others. And two, they say that governments are made up of individuals. But members of government shouldn't make decisions on behalf of the entire country based off of how they make their own personal decisions. That's why political philosophy from a value of government legitimacy is far better than valuing morality on its own. You should judge the debate further through my criterion of protecting citizens rather than the harm principle. One, they concede that the social contract is the foundation of our society. A state allows for a social contract in which citizens offer up a few of their rights in exchange for the government to protect their other rights. The only reason we subject ourselves to a government is to gain this protection. Thus, protecting citizens is the proper criterion. Two, their standard of harm being avoided and death and suffering doesn't help us make complex ethical choices where the likelihood is those tragedies are going to exist in either the world of the AF or the neg. The criterion doesn't differentiate between what deaths and what types of suffering matter the most, making it an ill-fitting tool to judge this debate. And three, the social contract is not agreed on between citizens of other countries and the United States, so the federal government's primary obligation is to its own citizens. That means that if I can prove that substantially reducing military presence in the WANA region would not protect citizens, your ethical duty in this round is to negate, to ensure the US government maintains its governmental legitimacy. We're going to now go on to the neg case, explaining why the negative has already won this round as we go through. Let's begin on the first contention. They first tell you that it's not unique, but here is the problem. The Cohen and Bremer evidence that they're reading says that our allies in the Middle East are currently hedging their bets because there's a potential that they might move into a China filling in, or they might move into Iran. That's important. They're not abandoning it. Our influence might be on the decline, but they're just hedging their bets at the moment, meaning that they're going to move towards whichever state is better for them in the long term. However, that means that if we do replace and reduce our presence substantially, that guarantees that they move into these other states, triggering the impacts that we're talking about within my first contention. Next, they tell you that there's no link in citing my own evidence from Duffy and 23. But the reallocation doesn't link into this case so long as it doesn't substantially reduce, which we'll touch on more when we go back to the counter plan, but ultimately it's that substantial reduction that's the key problem in this round. Third, they make this turn, saying that we're able to enable focus. But Ashford and Kronig is ultimately wrong here, for a few reasons. One, we aren't increasing our involvement, which is the first thing that Ashford and Kronig is talking about. Second, it's saying that the U.S. can't be involved in three different wars at the same time. But it also notes that in such a situation were to occur, that we have to at all costs, because it's our moral obligation, because it helps ensure that a government retains its legitimacy. That's functionally key. Even though Ashford and Kronig might warn us a little bit about what potentially could happen, they're saying that we need to maintain our presence here. Lastly, note that they don't address the actual impacts that we go for in the first contention of China filling in, potentially sparking conflict with Taiwan, and Iran filling in, potentially sparking even further conflict, enlarging the Israel-Hamas conflict as it is. At the point where they don't engage with either of these arguments, you can vote for the negative right now. It's game over for AF. On to the arguments on the counterplan. They want to say that you can do both. But the problem, and they cite the Duffy evidence, the problem is the evidence isn't saying a 50% reduction. Remember, that's the definition we agreed to from the beginning of the round. What it's talking about is a reallocation of forces. Even if there is a reduction of who is there, it's not a 50%, so it's not substantial. Second, Lawrence and 23 demonstrate that we would still have forces in key regions. They tell you that the reallocating fails, but Lawrence and 23 demonstrates that that's simply not the case. Finally, if we do end up leaving, that links back into the contention one to begin with. Doing both the counterplan and the advocacy means that the problems outlined in the first contention still occur. You want to be prioritizing this then when you're making your decision. Onto the AF case. First, on their contention one, they tell you that small-scale conflicts are going to snowball. The problem is this Mitchell and 23 evidence doesn't address the Yakuba in 23, which explains that we have reports from Hezbollah and Iran that show that they're not going to engage. Mitchell says that if we get attacked, that's what's going to happen. My evidence shows that we're not going to get attacked in the first place. Then they tell you this Atkins in 19 is impossible because of tensions that are ongoing. And they make this attack in our response in the second contention as well. You can group all these responses together. First off, because when we actually create the presence, Olson in 23 explains that this bolsters our relationships with key allies in the region. That's a key reason to be voting for the negative. When our evidence actively postdates and demonstrates that our ability to have bases and be able to work with other states on a security basis means that we're able to actually benefit the region as a whole, that's what you need to be looking towards actually preventing further harm. Finally, on the second contention of terrorism, again, that Olson 23 evidence applies to the Atkins attack. Next, they tell you that it's clearly failed. But Tadolino doesn't say it's clearly failed. That evidence says that when we reduced by a substantial margin, things went really bad in Syria, and ISIS became a much more dangerous threat. That's functionally another reason why you're voting for the negative at the end of the round. When it comes down to it, we need to prioritize government legitimacy by not actively reducing our presence, but by reallocating.
I will first clarify the framework for judging the debate and then provide 2 reasons to vote affirmative. Is everyone ready? Okay, then I will begin. Because the world needs peace, not the United States military presence, I am proud to affirm. A government that is supported by its citizens to wreak havoc on millions of lives abroad does not sound legitimate to me, which is why you're prioritizing the value of morality. Base your decision on aligning with a normative code of ethics that tells you what is right and wrong. This decision affects more than just United States citizens, which is why governmental legitimacy is not the proper value. Focus on morality so that we can focus on our consequences to our own citizens and citizens elsewhere. Their philosophy of protecting citizens from Thomas Hobbes is wrong. The rights of your own citizens to do whatever they want is not the only way to determine whether a government is behaving properly. So if you vote for the affirmative framework, that means you're voting for the side that fulfills the duty to avoid harm. And there are 2 reasons why voting affirmative is the way to do that. The first voter is that decreasing military presence will protect US troops. They've conceded that the only way Iran is going to escalate the conflict to catastrophic levels is if the United States is retaliating based on small-scale attacks. Small-scale attacks have yet to claim a US soldier's life, but that will inevitably occur unless we reduce our military presence. If we get drawn into war in the Middle East, which is inevitable if you vote for the negative, then that will enable China to attack Taiwan because we'll be fighting 2 wars elsewhere, the one with Ukraine and one in the Middle East. They say that we should reallocate rather than reduce, but the Duffy 23 evidence says consolidate, as in minimize and then focus your troops at a select number of bases. They only name 3 countries that we should maintain a presence in, whereas right now we have a presence in 22. Clearly, the Duffy evidence says that we should substantially reduce, and at best, whatever's left, we can focus on reallocating them. The second reason you're voting for the affirmative is that decreasing our military presence will protect citizens around the world from the harms of terrorism. They do not have a way to access why terrorists become terrorists in the first place. Our military presence results in heinous acts committed against regional actors, which spurs anti-American sentiment, motivating extremism and radicalization, which then is used to justify terrorist attacks. At best, they've won that the risk of terrorism against the United States at home is low, but they've conceded our presence has massively increased terrorist acts of aggression across the WANA region, wreaking havoc on the lives of millions. They tell you that terrorism will increase if we reduce our presence, but when our military presence was at its highest, terrorism was still happening. So if we control the reason why people become terrorists, we reduce the military presence, decreasing anti-American sentiments, decreasing terrorist motivations, saving lives. Your ethical duty in this round is to avoid harm, and it is clear that you avoid harm by voting for the affirmative. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.
Idaho.
And I'm Joseph Tyler, head coach for...